Hey everyone, Chris here with another filler video. Now, at first glance, it may seem like I'm reviewing some random old DOS platformer that you might have missed out on, but this is actually a more modern game, released in 2013, done in an EGA graphics style known simply as MURI, which, because it's all caps, I thought it was an acronym, but in all of my searching, I couldn't find any details on what it stood for. Until by chance, I spotted something seemingly unrelated in my search results and discovered it may not actually be an acronym at all. Instead, it's more likely that it's a transliteration to English from Japanese for one of the various ways of saying impossible in that language, which, given the context of the story here, would actually make a lot of sense. But yeah, I've actually been holding off on talking about this game for quite a while now because I don't really have much to say about it. In fact, I kind of still don't. But I kept it in mind as something to return to in the future, just to remind people that it exists, and to get it some extra attention once it was past its prime. So that's where we're at now. The game was developed primarily by one Daniel Remar, going under the moniker of Remar Games, and was ultimately published through Ludosity, the same Ludosity who's done the Princess Remedy and It'll Do games that I've mentioned before. Now, something I have to admit right away is I don't actually like the story for this game. It's fatalistic, doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, and ultimately comes across as highly contrived. But, to summarize it as best as I can, it takes place at some point in the distant future where mankind has a thriving colony on Mars and a research station in orbit which is doing controversial studies into life and death. Said station then makes a particularly poignant discovery and incorporates those results into a new type of armored suit dubbed the MURI suit. Fearing what might come of this technology, Earth prepares to send an invasion force to Mars to stop any further development of the suit, when all of a sudden, Mars disappears. Now that's where the backstory ends and the game begins, but let's dive just a little bit deeper so that everything makes at least a little more sense for any of you who decide to play the game following this video. Firstly, they didn't just make one MURI suit, they made 4, one for each member of the family who was working on the project. Kojo, the lead scientist, his sister Essie, his father Kwaku, and you actually play the role of Kojo's mother, Adwoa, who wakes up on their research station a long period of time following it landing on Earth, as she had set her sleeper capsule for the trip to keep her under a bit longer than she intended. Unfortunately, upon waking up and seeing that their research station had been overrun by Earth's robot armies, Adwoa quickly discovers the robots hadn't been prepared properly as they proceeded to annihilate all life on the planet prior to her arrival. The other thing you might want to know is what exactly makes these boring-looking MURI suits incredibly powerful, beyond the array of weapons that they can utilize. To put it simply, the ability to absorb life energy in any quantity and convert it into other forms of life energy. Kind of like the Genesis device from Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Now, I won't say any more than that because then I'd end up spoiling the story, but knowing that key detail helps make a lot of what's going on make a lot more sense. Otherwise, you're just going to be in a haze about everything until the very end, and even then it still might not make a lot of sense without being directly told that plot point ahead of time. Anyways, let's talk about the gameplay itself. Now, if the first game which comes to mind as you're seeing this is the original Duke Nukem, then really, you're kind of spot on there, though it does do things slightly differently. The game is split up into 4 separate episodes, each of which has 4 regular levels and a 5th boss level, with any weapons or such collected in one episode not carrying over between episodes. This is pertinent because the game will often give you an infinite supply of one or more of the stronger weapons near or at the end of each episode, while normally you pick up the extra weapons in packs of 20 shots. Before starting the game, you're able to select your skill level between one of 4 settings. At first, I wasn't quite sure what the differences were, but the help system in the game has a page which lists all of the changes between the different difficulty settings, with the main differences being related to energy levels and extra lives, as well as how challenging the bosses are. The various enemies you face do not change in quantity or quality by skill setting. You're also able to play the game at one of 2 frame rates, 16 or 32. While it may seem like odd selections, it's really not. The original Duke Nukem actually ran at a frame rate of 16. Odd as it would have been, since that frame rate doesn't match up with any of the usual timing metrics found in DOS. But I actually find it surprisingly hard to play MURI at 16 FPS, even though I can play Duke Nukem that way just fine. I eventually figured out, while watching footage of the two side by side, that it has to do with how the camera follows the player. In Duke Nukem, there's a small box in the middle of the screen Duke can move around in without scrolling the screen, while MURI uses an always centered camera. Normally, I'm okay with always centered cameras, but this kind of proves to me that I'm only okay with it with a high frame rate. So just something to keep in mind when it comes to deciding between which frame rate you want to play the game at. The goal of each level is simply to reach an exit gate, at which point you get a time bonus and then proceed to the next level. There are some minor puzzle elements to some of the levels, but for the most part, each level is pretty straightforward, though it's typically loaded with secrets, some of which require you to blast your way in, even though it doesn't seem like there's anything to blast. Also keep in mind that some things you can blast apart are behind foreground elements, meaning you won't visually see what it is that you blasted apart. The main reason to do any of this, though, is if you're going for a high score, as the game does track if and when you reach 100% of all scoring elements in a level, or if you're trying to find the cells which are used to gain access to powerful items late in every episode. As for weapons, you have 6 in total, but only start with an infinite supply of 1, your main gun, which has a moderate rate of fire. You can also find rapid shots, which fire much more rapidly, the Mark V, which is a 5-way spreading shot, the laser, which fires a shot which does double damage itself, or if it hits a wall, will split into 2 rebounding shots, which each do normal damage, the mega gun, which fires very powerful shots which have a slight bit of tracking to them, and finally, the chaos weapon, which blasts out a huge burst of attacks, which also have some homing capabilities. Regardless of what weapons you have, though, the game doesn't let you select your weapons manually. Whatever weapon is the most powerful and in stock is the weapon you will fire. And this can be particularly annoying when you have laser or mega shots at the ready, but need the spread of the Mark V shots to reliably hit something. I kinda understand why it was done this way, but at the same time, it would have been nice to have an option for manual weapon selection, and especially since the ammo is tracked independently for each weapon in your arsenal. And the last thing to point out really is that, much like a certain Italian plumber, you can damage virtually every enemy in the game simply by jumping on it. And yeah, I know the jump arc in this game is entirely linear instead of having a proper arc to it. Thankfully, you also have a very high jump height, so because of that, the weird jump arc doesn't really upset me all that much. So yeah, as you can see, really hard to make much of a full video about this game. I think if there were more mechanics in play in the levels, there'd be more to talk about. But the raw gameplay is as basic as it can get, short of some force fields you bypass by shooting out their power cores, but that's it really. Thus, for a game this simple, feigning EGA colors and PC speaker audio, you would think this game would be a prime candidate for being converted into an actual DOS executable. Well, funnily enough, someone tried. If you've heard the name Foon Turing, then yeah, they've turned up a few times in random videos across the web, and this time around it's because they'd made an attempt to convert this game into a DOS game back in 2016. Unfortunately, they hit some snags and ultimately abandoned the project because, again, this game isn't actually using EGA display modes or a PC speaker sound driver. Heck, it's not even all source code, as the game was done in GameMaker, and thus much of the quote-unquote code is the stuff GameMaker does on its own accord, and thus there's no easy way to port that proprietary functionality without recreating it all entirely from scratch by guessing at how it all works. And I'll put a link to Foon's WordPress blog in the video description, where they go over some of those preliminary challenges faced while trying to do this port, and if you'd like to see more of the difficulties encountered in just the first few days of trying to do it. Also, one of my Patreon supporters, Vishnu Patrizik, whose name I'm almost certainly not pronouncing right, had a simple question to ask in relation not so much to this game itself, but the legacy which inspired it, wondering, are there any other not-so-old games which are similar to Duke Nukem 1? Unfortunately, not really. I know of someone who's been working on and off on such a game in their spare time, but that's about it. And I think the closest we can get to that sort of thing right now are the HD remakes of Secret Agent and Crystal Caves. But in terms of the exact style of gameplay found in the original Duke Nukem, MURI is pretty much it. Though if anyone knows of any similar modern games that I may have missed out on, definitely post about them in the comments. I should point out though that there's quite a number of difficulties when it comes to trying to make a game which mimics the original Duke Nukem, and one of the things I always say as one game designer to another is to never artificially handicap yourself just for sake of an aesthetic. For instance, if your game idea works better with HD graphics, but you're dead set on making it CGA 4 color, then guess what? You're never going to end up making the game you wanted to make because your vision for it is always going to be several generations beyond that arbitrary limit that you put on yourself. But if your idea works perfectly fine with that CGA aesthetic without compromising what you want to do with your game, then by all means, make it CGA. Or you could even do what I did with Pixelmusement Retro and split the difference, adopting a mix of styles, such as CGA colors but with HD resolution. Whereas with Pixelmusement Retro, I was aiming for a mix between NES and Atari 2600 aesthetics, and admittedly missed the mark somewhat and learned some lessons as a result of that. As for MURI, it's an interesting game for sure, but one which I don't really connect with, which is part of the reason why it's taken me so long to get around to talking about it. Not to mention, despite the difficulty selections in place, I find this game somewhat easy. And not super easy, but certainly easier than the DOS games it was inspired by. And hey, if you yourself want a modern DOS-inspired run-and-gun platformer and don't mind a weak story driving it, then just hit up the game on Steam and you can grab a copy quick and cheap for $5. Again, links in the video description for those who want to give it a try. Anywho, that'll be all for today's filler. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on March 30th, will be a standard review, episode 325, where we're going to be taking a look at a game that's all about delivering pizzas. Yeah, that game about delivering pizzas. I suspect a lot of you know what it's going to be, so be sure to stay tuned to see how it fares decades beyond its relevance. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to all the people seen here supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to join in with them and support the show directly, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.